Welcome back. We will start with lecture 4 today, lecture 4 of module 4. In this lecture, we will introduce the idea of language socialization and how language socialization is part of a larger question within the language culture interaction and the question of creating identities and ideologies and so on and so forth. So, first let us look at the concept, what is the idea of language socialization. Now, this is a paradigm, this is a socialization, language socialization is a theoretical as well as a methodological paradigm that deals with how individuals acquire habitus. We have talked about habitus and capital before. So, habitus primarily refers to how you are, how one is, what is the ways of living, ways of being in the world, or in our case in a particular community, how a person acquires the qualities of being a member of a particular given community. How do you know that one person, just because he speaks a language, he or she does not automatically become a member of the community. They also have to have what is called communicative competence, that we have already seen before. Now, how does one acquire that? What is the process? That is what we will look at here, that process is called language socialization. So, primarily the focus is how a novice in our case, this refers to the child typically, or it can also refer to somebody who is learning another language, that is possible, but largely we are referring to children. So, how a novice acquires the competence to become a member of the community, that is the most important thing. And specifically, the how language helps somebody becoming that member, how does language play a very important role in creating that kind of an identity, creating that kind of a membership of a person within a larger community, that is the idea. So, this though the studies, the ideas were there before, but typically we go back to a seminal paper and landmark paper in 1986 and also one in 1984 by the same group, where written by Schieffelin and Oakes. They outline the two main concerns of the concept. So, when we talk about language socialization, we typically go back to this particular work, this particular group of researchers who have put out the theory and the methodological finesse and others. And of course, there are many other scholars, as we will see, but this is where in their 1986 article called language socialization, there they have outline the two main concepts that are connected to this paradigm. One is called socialization through the use of language and the other is socialization to use language. Both ways, it is not a one way street. Socialization happens through language because language is a tool for us to negotiate our position in the world, that is one, but equally important is the socialization to use language itself. It is a complex phenomenon. So, as a result of which this idea, this entire concept is very comfortably sits in the intersection of a number of disciplines. For example, the idea, this concept of language socialization draws on sociological, anthropological and psychological approaches to the study of social and linguistic competence. So, we know linguistic competence, we have also talked about communicative competence. Now, communicative competence has a lot to do with social competence. So, that is why this idea is connected to all of these different disciplinary domains. Slightly let us unpack what we mean by those contributions of those domains. So, the sociological perspective primarily brings the idea that social structures are outcomes of social practices. How do you create a structure? There are structures that get built in a society and then destroyed as well. So, those social identities or social structures, they how do they arise, how do they get created? They get created through various kinds of practices, social practices. So, that within that language is also one particular important phenomenon. So, these practices include the process of negotiating relationships, outcomes and meanings and how new realities and meanings are constructed during such social interactions. So, social interactions are more often than not dependent on language. Now, these ideas go back to all the way to Bernstein and Bourdieu's work. We have talked about Bourdieu before when we talked about Capital and Habitus. So, this is the crux of those that standpoint that also has a connect with our language socialization. Now, the other important aspect, or let us say a connected aspect of this entire idea is the interactional aspect. The interaction shapes the way a particular identity is created or somebody gets a membership within a larger community. So, interaction plays a role, and this aspect overlaps with Vygotsky's socio-cognitive theory of scaffolding. So, Vygotsky's idea with respect to cognitive development, he has he has of course tremendous contribution, but two of the ideas that are more closely connected to our idea of language socialization, which is one is the more knowledgeable other and the zone of proximal development. So, cognitive development of the child typically happens when they interact with the more knowledgeable others, typically the caregivers, parents, teachers or whoever is there. So, there is this interaction, and thereby through a constructive process the child creates his or her own mental development, or the child also creates their own understanding of the world and so on and so forth, the schematic understanding. So, all of these are we are tracing it back to our idea of Vygotskyan socio-cognitive practices. Then we have the linguistic anthropological aspect, which that takes us to the ideas of linguistic relativity and communicative competence, which I have which I was talking about just now. Communicative competence, of course, we have already seen. Linguistic relativity talks about the idea where different communities have different world views, and it is dependent upon. So, the language structure, the way language structures reality depends on the lived experiences of that particular community. So, this is also an idea that is closely connected to language socialization. And this idea also draws upon the ethnography of communication by Delheims, where language is conceived as a socially situated cultural form. These are all of these ideas, whether it is sociology or psychology, linguistic anthropology or relativity or communicative competence, all of them have one idea that is integral to them, which is that there is a culture specific way of communicating, and that in turn creates a particular kind of a reality for the given community and its members. So, that is why we said that this is connected to the idea of language socialization is connected to all of these previous already existing. Now, the automatic question that might arise is, if we already had so many disciplines, so many academic endeavors looking at the question of language and communication with their in terms of their relationship with the culture and how situated socially constructed ideas are already there out there in the world, what was the necessity for creating another domain? That might be a question that automatically comes to your mind. Hence, that brings us to the motivation of creating this concept or creating this domain of research. The primary motivation was that around the time when this developed, though the ideas of all the previous ideas that we have seen were already around, however, there was a serious division, serious separation between two different domains which dealt with similar kind of things. So, there was some gap in the research that the researchers wanted to bridge. What was the gap? One was the developmental psycholinguistic literature on language acquisition. Large part of this research was primarily on experimental empirical methods using various kinds of techniques to look at how language development works, and it was almost entirely devoid of the cross cultural aspect. That nuance was not yet incorporated into the research in developmental psycholinguistics. That was one. Second domain that was looking at it was anthropological literature on child socialization. So, this was a different domain. This was a domain within anthropology that looked at how children socialize, how child socialization happen. Now, the idea was that these two different domains actually could come together because both of them could benefit from each other. So, now on the one hand language acquisition studies, culture was left behind, that is the primary idea. One of the domains where that has been noticed, for example, is the domain of baby talk. Baby talk register or motherese as we call them, that was studied extensively as to how the way mothers talk to their children, how baby talk register works, whether it has an impact on the way the child learns language and whether it does not. These ideas have been experimentally studied. Now, the problem with this was majority of these studies focused on white middle class North American or North European children. Now, this meant that the socio-cultural influences on speech practices were almost invisible. Why? Because the communities that were studied were more or less similar. So, the way the baby talk register was studied, the way child development was studied using psycholinguistic methods took for granted a lot of socio-cultural background information, because there was a lot of homogeneity. Research on non-western and non-middle class communities at the same time from other perspectives revealed that those practices were not necessarily the same for children of other communities. So, these were not, there was possibility of differences in the other kinds of communities. That was one domain that was noticed by the researchers, like for example, Oakes and Schieffelin and others. Similarly, in child socialization studies, the role of language was largely ignored. Though they were looking at socialization as a practice, language was not incorporated as one of the important ingredients or important parameters, let us say. So, the socialization mainly was treated as the transmission of cultural values, but without looking at language. For example, a very well known study by Margaret Mead's work in Samoa and New Guinea. So, it also emphasized enculturation, where children were considered to be passive recipients of culture. So, these were the two domains that did not have much to do with each other. There was not much of a give and take. Now, given this background, language socialization as a domain of study was developed. It was actually developed by a group of researchers consciously, because there was such kind of a gap that existed at that time. But even though the credit goes to Oakes and Schieffelin's landmark work in 1984 and 86, the seeds of this development were there much before that. In fact, in the 60s itself, most importantly, there is this University of California, Berkeley Language Behavior Research Laboratory. Now, here there was a group of psychologists, linguists and anthropologists who came together to formulate a new research area on language acquisition, primarily focusing on this interrelation between different factors that were not taken into account before. The agenda of this research group as to what they were looking at, what were the primary points to look at, these were elaborated in a book, a field manual for cross cultural study of the acquisition of communicative competence by Slobin 1967. So, that was another landmark thing. So, the laboratory came together, brought together people from different specializations, and at the same time there was this manual that was released. So, the ideas proposed in this was inspired by the works of Gumpers and Hyams. So, communicative competence and all of those things. 60s and 70s were marked by empirical studies of cross-cultural comparisons on children's acquisition of communicative competence, and these studies throughout 60s and 70s this went on, and such studies pointed out the linguistic, social and cultural processes underlying children's communicative development. And then we come to our most important contributors. So, in 1975 to 1977, Schieffelin conducted a longitudinal study of children's language acquisition among the Kalule people of Papua New Guinea. That was one important landmark study. At the same time, 78-79, Oakes conducted a longitudinal study of Samoan children's language acquisition. Both of these researchers used both psycholinguistic and anthropological methods. The result of their longitudinal study of all these years were finally proposed as the thesis of language socialization. However, there are two more important works that came out around the same time. So, shortly before the publication of Oakes and Schieffelin's article, there were two books that came out. One was Shirley Bryce Heath's book Ways with Words. This particular work looked at the black and white working class families from American Southeast. Remember, till then the focus of language acquisition studies were primarily on the middle class, white middle class families, but this in this particular work, the Shirley Bryce looked at the working class, both black and white working class groups, their children. Similarly, another very important work from that time, Susan Phillips' book The Invisible Culture. She presented work on the Native American children from a particular reservation. So, the Warm Spring Indian Reservation. So, both the works compare the findings from their target group with the dominant cultures as well. So, this is how they brought out very subtle nuances in cross cultural differences within the language acquisition, communicative competence and so on. And eventually, based on their findings, Oakes and Schieffelin proposed this. They proposed that the process of acquiring language is embedded in and constitutive of the process of becoming socialized to be a competent member of a social group. That was one. And similarly, they also propose socialization practices and ideologies impact language acquisition concert with neurodevelopmental in concert with the neurodevelopmental influences. So, language acquisition and is part of language acquisition and socialization are integral part of each other, and they together they create the person who becomes a member of the community. So, this was a seminal article that laid the basic premises and the early findings on language socialization of a paradigm. So, based on this, the idea of what is language socialization, of course, they gave their own definition, but over time the theory has become quite influential. In fact, as a recent publication called it enormously influential and illuminating, and as a result there have been multiple definitions that are there in the academic world. So, there is the work of Duff, then many others. So, for example, Duff in 1995 defined this language socialization as the lifelong process by which individuals, typically novices, everybody underlined the idea of novices, primarily pointing towards children, because children through their language acquisition and through socialization eventually situate themselves as an active and integral part of the active member and integral part of the community. So, novices are inducted into specific domains of knowledge, beliefs, affect, roles, identities and social representations, which they access and construct through language practices and social interaction. Over time, the definitions have undergone some changes, some updating, and it is not only anymore restricted to a particular speech community, but it also refers to various kinds of social groupings. So, it can be based on beliefs, it can be based on identities of different types and so on and so forth. So, that kind of change has also happened. For example, Duff, this was 1995, in 2010, many years later, he says that the acquisition of linguistic, pragmatic and other cultural knowledge through social experience and is often equated with the development of cultural and communicative competence. So, as you socialize using language, many things change, and this is the entire thing can be called a social experience. And then eventually Schieffelin and Oakes also have given updated definition hinges on the potential of embodied communication to engage novices in apprehending and realizing familiar and novel ways of thinking, feeling and acting with others across the lifespan. So, you can continuous, it does not stop in your childhood, throughout our life, through using language, through interaction with different social groups, we can constantly create, recreate and also dismantle different ideas and identities. So, there are many other such definitions given later as well by others. So, primarily this explores how people learn to participate in the speech events and activities of everyday life. So, even things like jokes and greetings, classroom lessons, storytelling or essay or memo writing, all of these will be also part of these practices. So, as we have just seen that this idea was proposed as a bridge between language acquisition studies and childhood socialization process. So, the primary idea is that children are not only socialized through language, but also socialized to use language. So, you learn language, but you have to also know how to use it appropriately in a given context. So, both of these are part of this. So, language becomes a central part of the most central dimension of becoming competent member of the group. Now, how do you study? So, the basic idea now is in place that we are looking at novices or typically children trying to become members of a particular community or whatever. It can be a speech community, it can be various other kinds of networks or groups or whatever, that where language plays an important role. So, your membership or your proper use of or let us say competent use of social and linguistic signals in a given particular scenario, all of these are based on language. But then how do you study them? There is this proposal that this should be studied, there should be 3 important variables that should always be there. So, it should be ethnographic in design, and it cannot be just go and collect data at one given point of time, however, but on the other hand it should be longitudinal in perspective. So, you should look at the design should be done in such a way that the community that you are studying or the group you are studying, you should be looking at them, studying them over a period of time. So, longitudinal in perspective, and they should demonstrate the acquisition of particular linguistic and cultural practices over time and across contexts. So, this is very crucial. So, over time how does the development take place within this broader domain and also across contexts. Different contexts will have different ways of communicating or being in the particular group and so on. There is an important distinction that we must make. Language socialization is not similar to general social interaction studies. That is also a domain of study which is connected, but they are not the same. What is the main difference? The main difference is that a clear theoretical and methodological focus is what separates it from the general social interaction kind of studies. Rather than viewing all interactions as socializing, they emphasize long term ethnography. So, not all random communication, but over period of time. It also traces how children and novices acquire culturally meaningful practices and become specific kinds of culturally intelligible subjects. Thus, the main question that they ask, and this is the main difference also. So, Margaret Mead asked, how do people vary cross culturally? But language socialization will ask, how do different kinds of culturally specific subjectivities come into being? How does it even get created? It is not that whether there is a difference. The main question is, how does that difference come about? What is it? What are the language practices? What are the interaction between language and social realities that makes it happen? That is the primary question that we are asking. So, the process socialization is an interactive process where the individual actively participates in constructing meaning and socio-cultural knowledge rather than being a passive recipient. Many of the studies, earlier studies in cultural socialization from anthropological perspective thought about children as a passive learner, not an active participant, but this is not how language socialization looks at it. And this process is grounded in symbolic interactionist theory, which sees reality including self and social roles as created through social interaction. So, you are creating your own identities through interaction, it is not fixed, that is the idea. Similarly, it takes place in various contexts. So, there are this idea goes back to 1980s, but as of today it has been many years, so many decades of studies. So, initially the focus was one small area, but now we can look at multiple contexts through which this kind of practice actually takes place. So, for example, the different contexts can be primarily at home, then we can have schools and community and so on and so forth. And then it includes both explicit teaching as well as implicit learning through observing. When we are part of a community, when we interact with a community, it does not have to be always conscious teaching or conscious learning. Simply by being in a group, you learn a lot of things. So, observing, implicit learning through observation also is an important paradigm here. And this process helps individuals learn social norms, cultural values, communicative competence and appropriate language behavior, language use relevant to the social groups. So, these are the basic points as to how. So, as to how children learn or how children become part of the active member of the community. Every social interaction is potentially a socializing experience where members influence and conform to one another through language. So, but then when it happens over a period of time, there is a pattern that will emerge, and that is what we study. So, linguistic skill as well as social and cultural knowledge, I have already talked about it. Vygotskian framework, I have mentioned it in the beginning, that Vygotskian frameworks largely focuses on the interaction of the agent of the child in terms of its cognitive development, and that interaction between the child and the more knowledgeable others. So, within the zone of proximal development, that is the fundamental and most important contribution of Vygotskian framework. So, that framework is what we are looking at here as well. So, cultural knowledge both organizes and is acquired through these interactions. So, these communicative activities between the child and the more knowledgeable other within that scaffolding. The concept of affect is an important concept within this. So, what does it refer to? Emotions. Affect largely talks about emotions. It refers to, this is an umbrella term. So, emotions like desire, fear, etc., are treated under the concept of affect. So, emotions, feelings, moods, attitudes, all are part of it. Now, they play a crucial role in forming culturally recognized subjectivities. The persona that you will eventually achieve is also, that also has a lot to do with the affect. The way affect is looked at in a particular culture, it is not the same everywhere. Okay, so, this is central to the theories of becoming in many in both scholarly as well as in local understanding. So, societies have ideas and conventions about how affect should be displayed, invoked, interpreted and so on. So, there are different cultures look at it differently. So, there is in some cultures there is a dichotomy between real and not real affect. For example, there are debates about real feelings and conventional, whether conventional affect actually reflects the reality, the difference between presence, absence, body and soul. These are dichotomies that have been presented in the literature, but many social groups do not uphold these dichotomies and do not prioritize sincerity in affective displays. So, there are many studies in this. And Hyams also emphasized the affect as a core feature of communicative competence. Thus, ability to display culturally appropriate affect is essential to becoming a recognizable social object. in my culture, the community I belong to, I might belong to different communities, whether it is a speech community, ethnic community, and many other, we are part of multiple groups at the same time, networks and groups at the same time. So, each of these groups will have their own unwritten rule, conventions, which we call conventions. There also the role of affect is very important. How do you display affect in a given situation? What kind of behavior with respect to emotion, mood, attitude is appropriate for a given context is very crucial for your membership in that group. So, that is why it has been separately discussed, and also there is a lot of work that is available in this. So, let us see some examples. Till now we are talking about theories and theoretical positions. This is quite an important study in Papua New Guinean village of Gapun. Now, in this particular community, anger is used as a structuring principle of social life. Anger is important here. We all know that anger is considered one of the enemies of us. Anger often destroys an otherwise good situation. If we are not able to control anger, it creates more problem than it ever solves. So, anger is in our society, anger is not considered a virtue. In this community, in this particular village in Gapun, anger is used as a structuring principle for social life. Women in this community are seen as selfish and prone to publicly vent anger. Men are on the other hand expected to suppress anger for social harmony. Now, causing anger is risky, and how do they do it? In childhood, when the children are being indirectly trained, anger is not actually told, they are not shown that anger is a bad thing. They are trained in such a way that anger is actually used as a tool to train them. In this community, they believe that infants are naturally stubborn, willful and aggressive. So, caregivers interpret even neutral actions as signs of dissatisfaction or anger. Now, first words attributed to babies express rejection or irritation. I am leaving, stop it. These are the things first apparently, this is the first things that children say, and that also fits into their idea of children being difficult, stubborn. So, as a result of this kind of a background understanding, caregivers actively encourage aggressive behavior such as urging an infant to hit a dog. Play with babies often include mock aggression displays and so on and so forth. So, this is not something that we can easily relate to. That is what we mean by affect, whether it is. So, in this case this is not real, what the caregivers are doing, this is not real. So, there is no distinction between real and actual feelings, actual emotions. These are all used as tools in order to, because they are encouraging the children, so that eventually they learn how to control it. That is the idea. The second example comes from Kaluli, another group in Papua New Guinea. They hold beliefs about the nature of children which is different from the Gapuns. Both of them are in Papua New Guinea, and there are two communities like this. Children are thought to be soft or helpless. It is the exact opposite of how the other group, the Gapun people think. So, helpless, vulnerable and having no understanding. First sounds children produce are recognized as no and bo, mother. So, mother and breast. So, basically children are helpless, dependent, soft, the kind of typically the angelic, the overall angelic feeling that we also can relate to. Now, these highlight nurture and relational care, not seen as willful or angry, but as needing active teaching to use language. You can see how Papua New Guinea is not a vast country, but even within that two cultures have a completely different, vastly different ways of dealing with small children and how to teach them to be an active member of the community. One uses affect, the other considers them soft and uses very careful techniques to handholds them very carefully. So, Kaluli caregivers do not use baby talk. Instead, once basic words are learnt, mothers employ the routine say it to train children. Kaluli children are understood to need to acquire assertive demeanors. So, there is no use of baby talk. A large amount of child language acquisition research actually has looked at baby talk, how mothers use a specific pattern of speech with their children when they are learning to speak, the beginning, the initial stages of their life, but that is not how the Kaluli caregivers do. Why don't they use? Because the goal is to move children from Tayo to Halaido. So, Tayo is the soft helpless kind of a being into somebody who is hard, with hardness symbolizing verbal and social competence. So, their way of training the children to become tough is this, not using baby talk and such. The speech mastery enables participation in reciprocity, an essential element of Kaluli social life. Another example comes from the Jewish community, the Hasidic Jewish community in New York. Their belief is that each person has a set of God given inclinations. So, good and bad, we have both, each individual has both the good and the bad inclination. Children are born morally innocent, but act primarily on selfish or immodest desires linked to evil inclination. They only acquire the inclination for good around age 12 to 13, when they become responsible for religious commandments. So, initially they are not able to behave, they are not able to have good inclinations, but it comes only later. So, specialization teaches children to recognize their evil side. So, socialization teaches the children to recognize their this means the evil side. So, you have they overtly teach children that you have a good and a bad side, and you have to, by praising the good. So, by using praising and shaming to guide behavior, linking obedience with parental love, community approval and so on and so forth, and thereby they are trained to become active member of the community. So, these are some examples that we have from different communities across the world. Broadly, the impact of language socialization have been crucial in highlighting cultural notions with regard to some important constructs in language acquisition research. Over a period of time, all these almost 3 decades of research has had a major impact on various domains, but primarily I have listed 2 here. One is important constructs in language acquisition research. For example, the baby talk register, how important is it, how across languages baby talk is used and how that is one. But on the other hand, now we know that there are communities which do not even use baby talk. They start as soon as they have started to speak, as soon as they have learned their first words, they are taught to speak properly like adults. So, they are trained to become the training to become an active member and of the community. That training starts from the very beginning without going through the baby talk register. So, that is important, that is one area where lot of important contributions have come in. Also, this has helped scholars to challenge discriminatory practices and beliefs in educational and other kinds of institutions. Most notably, the differences that we see, and that also that results in discrimination come from research in language acquisition, multilingualism, language shift, literacy, ethnicity related studies and so on. So, the data from language socialization research have helped researchers challenge those discriminatory practices. However, there are some criticisms of the language socialization research as well. There are very few, but they are there. One of the strand of research has talked about the idea of novice in the language socialization practice. Idea of novice, they say that novice is a term that needs some qualification. For example, it can only be used in a relative sense. So, not all children are novice in the sense that the idea of novice within language socialization is that they do not know anything. Small children are literally starting their life. So, they have no idea about the socialization practices in the community that they are part of. Now, this view says that let us not consider children only as adults in the making. Children themselves are part and parcel of a cultural group in themselves. They are also, children are cultural actors. So, rather than considering them as somewhat inferior to adults, we also need to look at children as cultural actors and for their own right. So, as a result of which they have proposed, for example, one a recent paper has talked about this idea, and they are proposing that let us reframe the notion of novice. And some other such criticisms have also been there, but largely language socialization is a rather interesting domain of research, and this has had a lot of positive impact. So, we can sum up like this: the domain of language socialization has opened up new vistas of language cultural interaction research, that is one, because the focus here is on cross cultural studies using methodological finesse to check how how the socialization practices actually are different languages and different cultures make different front, let us say different techniques as important. So, cultural competence, linguistic competence, all of these depend on the specific language and culture that it comes from. So, as a result, this has broadened our understanding of speech community, because this module we are talking about speech community. So, for speech community and the understanding of groupings of different kinds of humans, human groups, be it ethnicity, race, or identity based or ideological based, all of these have been studied. So, language socialization as a brings in a new perspective, and it has also contributed quite well to this entire understanding of how humans come together, they form a community, and what it means to be a part of a community or become a part of a given community. So, that is where we will complete this lecture. This is the end of lecture 4. In the next lecture, we will look at some more case studies from all the topics that we have covered in this module so far. Thank you.